Vamos a presentar el profesor Tinterow, es conservador del Metropolitan Museum of Art. Desde el 1983 entra como conservador de la pintura europea del siglo XIX, una colección que tiene una colección absolutamente extraordinaria de pintura de esta época, y últimamente ha sido nombrado conservador no solamente del XIX, pero ampliando sus responsabilidades también al siglo XX y a la contemporaneidad. Es un paso muy interesante que desde el punto de vista de los otros museos nos interesa mucho esta decisión de, decimos, incorporar el siglo XIX a la contemporaneidad, y nos interesa mucho conocer su experiencia de esto. Gary ha sido comisario de muchas exposiciones, hasta alguno que se ha celebrado importante en España. En 1885 se celebra una gran exposición sobre Juan Gris, una retrospectiva en la Biblioteca Nacional, que algunos que están aquí se recordarán. Últimamente, y en cierta colaboración también con nuestro museo, por lo menos una participación importante por parte del Museo del Prado, fue la exposición que se celebró tanto en París como en Nueva York, que se llamaba The French Taste for Spanish Painting, el gusto francés por la pintura española, que fue realmente una exposición descubrimiento, una exposición que dio a conocer la fascinación especial que significó para los artistas y viajadores, pero fundamentalmente los artistas viajeros del siglo XIX, del arte español, y fundamentalmente el descubrimiento de Velázquez y posteriormente también del Greco. Entonces nos va a hablar esta mañana de maneras de presentar la pintura moderna en el Metropolitan, 1880 a 2007. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela. And I ask all of you for your indulgence in speaking to you in English today. As Gabriela told you, my talk to you will be on the subject of the presentation of modern art at the Metropolitan Museum from its founding in 1870 until the present day. And primarily what this means is European painting, because from the beginning, although the Metropolitan exhibited American art, work by American artists, it always privileged European art, and I must say it still does to this day. A near-perfect installation. These were the words of the critic of the New York Times, Ada Louise Huxtable, in 1980, so 27 years ago, when she saw these galleries for the first time, the Metropolitan Museum's modern display of its collection of 19th century painting. These near-perfect galleries, which were then called the André Meyer Galleries in honor of a financier who helped pay for the installation. These galleries were called a permanent installation. Permanent. But only 11 years later, they were closed. So those of you who visited the Metropolitan Museum between 1980 and 1991 will remember these galleries, which were so modern. These are, of course, all the famous 19th century paintings from our collection, but as you see how they were displayed on these temporary partitions in a vast space, almost like an airport with a glass ceiling. And they were closed in 1991 and replaced with the galleries that you see here on the slide, which opened in 1993. We went from a plan like this to a plan like this. So our step into the future was a giant step back into the past, because the new galleries were conceptually and architecturally the opposite of what we had only 10 years before made. And a famous curator of the Metropolitan Museum in 1965 wrote, "Since the very first building plans were made, no year has passed when some part of the building was in the hands of architects. The building has never been completed. If new construction was not in progress, interior reconstruction and rearrangement was always underway. You can think of the museum like a coral reef that's constantly growing, evolving, and changing to suit the collection and to suit the taste of the time. And the picture galleries, of course, are always changing. From the very first display at 681 Fifth Avenue in a dancing hall, to our first temporary quarters in a mansion off of Fifth Avenue called the Douglas Mansion, to the skylit gallery that today greets visitors at the top of the Great Staircase, hung with our magnificent paintings by Tiepolo, to the modern galleries for the New York School painting. You see here paintings by Ellsworth Kelly and Diepenkorn and others. The creation of up-to-date galleries, properly lit, with the right labels. These have been the concerns of architects and curators at the museum since its creation. But a retrospective and historical look at the museum's galleries for 19th century pictures suggests that permanent installations never last 10 years. Very few have ever lasted a generation. And the destruction of the André Meyer galleries, which seems at first to be a very dramatic about-face, it's only a typical manifestation of the pattern at the museum, our evolving coral reef. Patterns of display are the most changeable of phenomena. The museum owned only a small picture collection, 174, mainly Dutch and Flemish paintings, when the Commission for the Central Park in Manhattan requested a building from the architect Calvert Vaux. Calvert Vaux was the architect for all the buildings in Central Park, and he worked with a landscape designer. He had a partner named Jacob Mold. But he delivered 4 handsome galleries for the first structure, which opened in 1879. And as you see, the door was in the park, not on Fifth Avenue. This building, by the way, still exists in the very middle of the Metropolitan Museum. If you know where our medieval hall is, do we have a pointer or no? With the mouse, or?
No, we'll get one for you.
Okay, I'll just point for a moment. But if you think of this building here, if you come to the Metropolitan Museum and you proceed inside on the main floor, you get to a large medieval hall for medieval art, and there's actually a great reredos from Valladolid, I think. Right? Yes. A beautiful early 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century Spanish reredos. It's in that middle space. And if you go to the Robert Leamon wing, which is a modern wing in Central Park, and you turn around, you see some arches and red brick, and these are the arches. One aspect, which is a fascinating irony at the Metropolitan Museum, as curators, we're conservadores, which means we're taking care of the past, we're keeping it. But one thing that we have little respect for is our building, in fact. And there are only a few places in the building today where you can see the evolution of the building. We're more likely to destroy the building than we are to preserve it intact. So we had only 174 paintings, but there were painting galleries. And so the first curators did what I'm still doing today, which is I go out to my community and I borrow from collectors what I don't have. And just today I'm borrowing works either by Damien Hirst or by Yves Klein or Cy Twombly, because we don't have the right examples for our collection. So too, the curators went out to the community and they borrowed works from wealthy collectors who were collecting contemporary art in New York. And so there were 2 galleries for contemporary art at one end of the building, both European and American. The Saturday Evening Post, which was an important newspaper at the 19th century, wrote in 1880, when they saw the first display of modern art at the Metropolitan Museum. And by the way, this is now the only art museum on view open to the public in Manhattan. They said, "The Hanging Committee," in other words, the curators, "has done a most remarkable and admirable work, perhaps the most remarkable ever seen at a public exhibition of paintings in this country. The features of this work are 2. A system of bold or delicate and suggestive balancings, and the commingling of Americans and foreigners without respect to their nationality." Thank you. Yeah. You walk through the 2 large galleries, and you feel that American art is not so bad after all, because you see that it stands up like a man by the side of its European fellows, and it neither blushes nor faints. The eye is not shocked to find a Gérôme next to an Eastman Johnsman, a Troyon balancing a William McGrath, a Bouguereau balancing a Henry Loup. And as a matter of course, the paintings were hung frame to frame, touching one another, 4 rows high, a manner that was customary in Europe since the late 16th century. But the effect must have seemed rather restrained and institutional in comparison to the luxurious private galleries, upholstered in silk velvet, enriched by ormolu, attached to the houses of the very same New Yorkers who were lending their paintings to the Metropolitan Museum. This is the house of a famous department store owner. His name was A.T. Stewart, and he at this time owned, they say I can point, but where is the, do you know how to operate it? There you go, there you go. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. So here you see a famous icon of the Metropolitan Museum, the Horse Fair by Rosa Bonheur. It had been shown at the World's Fair in Paris in 1855, celebrated not only because of its muscular style, but because it was painted by a woman artist, an artist who had to wear pants in order to pass unnoticed in the streets of Paris. And so this, as you see, very interested collector. He had so many works, they were just seated along the floor. After he died, one of the wealthiest Americans at the time, Cornelius Vanderbilt, he owned railroads, bought this painting and presented it to the Met. But to compare, you see how institutional, museum-like, public institution compared to what the true collectors were, how they were exhibiting their paintings at home. Oh, here, just about 10 years later, in a more restrained style, this, I believe, is the gallery that Benjamin Altman had attached to his house. Well, no sooner had the first galleries opened that they were suddenly too small. So in 1884, the museum commissioned an architect named Theodore Weston. He was a very minor architect, but he happened to be working at the museum, and he was in charge of the art school that the Met had. We no longer have an art school, but of course this was a great tradition. It was true at the Pushkin Museum, it was true, still is true at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, to have a school of art attached to the collection. So this Theodore Weston created a new set of galleries, and here you see an interior view. Here's the exterior. You see that the original building is there, and here's his addition. And the addition you can see at the Met, when you go to our sculpture hall for European sculpture, you see this facade still here. But it's a slight change in style. Here we have pointed Gothic, a kind of Venetian Gothic, associated with the British critic John Ruskin as a high point in architectural integrity. But time was moving on, and in only 10 years, this neo-Greek style was considered to be more modern. But the interior galleries were based on the same model, and I must say they were very modest and almost rather embarrassingly cheap. They used, rather than fabric on the walls, a kind of cardboard called lincrusta that was painted and embossed with a pattern to create the effect of silk damask, but in fact, of course, was not. And the floor was so, the wood of the floor was so inexpensive and made so cheaply that it would absorb oil and wax, and it became a fire hazard. The lighting was inadequate. So you see this was a public museum that was very popular, but its popularity outstripped its resources. And they were not able, although they were quickly building new galleries, they were making them quite cheaply and inexpensively. But the public was coming in huge numbers, wearing away the floor, touching the walls, a problem, of course, that any successful museum has. They asked then for another wing called Wing C, because all of our additions at the museum are numbered by the alphabet, A, B, C. So first there was A, then there was B, on the other side, C. We had a famous architect who was on the board of trustees. He was called Richard Morris Hunt. He had studied in Paris and in Rome, and he warned the Metropolitan trustees about hiring this bad architect to make these ugly galleries. And when they hired yet another, even worse architect to make Wing C, Hunt resigned from the board and said, "You people are hopeless. I don't want to be part of it. There are good architects. You don't have to hire me. There are many other important architects around the world, but you're building your buildings too quickly. You're not studying the problem, and the results are not satisfactory." So he resigned. They got him back on the board, and they asked him to present a master plan for the building. And Richard Morris Hunt was able to make the plans for his first wing, which is going to be the Great Hall, which you'll recognize from the Fifth Avenue facade of the Metropolitan Museum. But unfortunately, he died before he could see this first work by him completed. And this was attached to those buildings I was just showing you, but for the first time, we're on Fifth Avenue and not facing the park, because it was a park building, and you came up the Park Drive in your carriage and you came to the Metropolitan Museum. But Richard Morris Hunt was turning the building away from the park and toward the street. And he was part of an important movement in America. It was called the Beautiful City Movement, in which American architects, mainly trained in Europe and primarily in Paris, were wanting to create civic monuments in what we call the Beaux-Arts style, because of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where they're attending school. But obviously it's a classical style, referring to the great civic buildings, but especially 18th and 19th century civic buildings in Europe. America was becoming a very rich nation, and it could afford to have civic monuments, and the architects wanted to rival the buildings that they had seen and studied in Europe. A firm called McKim, Mead and White, and McKim had worked with Richard Morse Hunt, succeeded Richard Morse Hunt after his death, and they were the house architects then for the Metropolitan Museum, and this is at the turn of the 20th century. And they were the first time that we had both a consistent set of house architects and people who began carefully to study the problems of display. The Metropolitan trustees realized that their fellow trustees in museums in Boston, Detroit, St. Louis had commissioned research and studies of the best examples of European museum design in London, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Berlin, Munich, here in Madrid. But the Metropolitan trustees had been in too much of a hurry. So while Boston Museum officials spent 5 years to determine what would be the proper height of a gallery between 21 feet and 24 feet, the proper width, about 32 feet, and the perfect ratio from the floor to the glass ceiling, from the glass ceiling to the skylight. In that length of time that the Boston Museum was simply making a study, the Metropolitan Museum was designing, building, opening to the public a building. We were proceeding too quickly. But McKim, Mead and White slowed down the process, and it's fascinating to read in the museum archives the details of the building committee meetings, because there was strong discussion on the part of the museum architects, curators, and trustees about how they should proceed. What we received were a handsome set of buildings, ultimately on Fifth Avenue, creating a unified classical facade in Indiana limestone, which is a preferred building material in New York City, off-white. But unfortunately, few of these galleries ever received the paintings collection, mainly other collections. Oops, uh-oh. Let's see, escape. Wrong button, now I'm really in trouble. Ayuda. Someone help me, I've touched the wrong button. Inez to the rescue. I think I touched this one or this one, but I'm not sure. Ah, there we are. Yeah, okay, we're good. Thank you. But there were a few exhibitions that were able to use these new classical galleries by McKim, Mead and White. A 1919 Courbet exhibition, a 1921 exhibition of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and here you see many loans from families that ultimately would give their collection to the Metropolitan Museum. But at the time, we didn't own these paintings. So here you see a wall of paintings from the Havemeyer collection. The Havemeyers owned the sugar monopoly in the United States. All the sugar was coming from their company, Imperial Sugar, or Domino Sugar. And you see some of their most famous paintings, Courbet, Degas, a painting then attributed to Francisco de Goya, and we know in fact it's just a pastiche. On the far end, you see a wall of works by Degas. But we didn't yet own many modern paintings. We did own one marvelous Spanish painting by Sorolla, and I learned today that you'll be having, in 2009, a large retrospective of Sorolla's work. Sorolla, at the beginning of the 20th century, was one of the most popular modern artists. His name was most recognized by New Yorkers, much more than Renoir. But in fact, Renoir would soon surpass Sorolla in the taste of American collectors, especially in New York collectors, who began to acquire works in Paris at the Galerie Vollard and at the Galerie Durand-Ruel of advanced painting, paintings by Gauguin, by Cézanne, for example. And this taste replaced the taste of a previous generation of New York collectors who had preferred more academic painting, or what we call salon painting, of the 19th century. Here's a famous work from the museum's collection by a man named Cot, or of Joan of Arc by Bastien Lepage. This was the previous taste, and this has just been supplanted by Cézanne and Gauguin. They were being acquired in the first years. So this Gauguin was bought, I think, before World War I by a New York collector. This Cézanne, 1913, was the first Cézanne to enter an American museum. And I should say that we got our first curator of paintings, of European paintings, only in 1907. So the Met was founded by a group of artists and philanthropists. In 1866, we were officially organized in 1870. We opened our doors in 1879, 1880. But not until 1906 did we have a curator of paintings. Until then, our curators were all curators of our directors of antiquities. And we had a very fascinating first curator. His name was Roger Fry. He was the editor of the Burlington magazine in London, a famous critic, very much interested in modern French painting, and he is credited with bringing a taste and knowledge for contemporary French art to an entire school of painting in Britain, the Bloomsbury Group, in the early 20th century. And so it's thanks to his influence that we bought, for example, this Cézanne in 1913, or this Renoir in 1907, Madame Charpentier and her children. But he was only acting on the same taste that advanced New Yorkers were had already acquired. But the museum trustees were not quite yet there. And of course, our collections weren't there. One of our most important early donors was a woman. Actually, I must say that female collectors and female donors have always ranked very highly at the Metropolitan Museum. There was a woman named Katherine Lorillard Wolfe, whose father had a real estate fortune, and whose mother came from a tobacco-selling family. And she was called the richest unmarried woman in America during her lifetime. She traveled extensively in Europe. And after the museum was founded, she went to Europe and she commissioned paintings from all the greatest living painters, or so-called, in their day: Cabanel, Bouguereau, Gérôme, Corot, Théodore Rousseau, Germans like Feuerbach and Menzel, Spanish, Madrazo, etc. And she gave us a collection of some 400 paintings, all by the most important famous artists, European artists of the day. And when she couldn't buy the painting that she wanted, she often commissioned a replica by the same artist. So that was our collection of contemporary art for the beginning years of the 20th century. But over time, that collection, as you see, was sent to the stairs and taken out of the galleries. And why is that? Because these important collectors of more modern art, the Havemeyers, Lewisons, etc., who were buying Manet, Cézanne, Gauguin were giving their collections to the Metropolitan Museum, and everything turned around in 1929 when Mrs. Havemeyer, whose husband was the sugar monopolist, died and left over 2,000 works of art to the Metropolitan Museum, suddenly giving us the most important collection of avant-garde French painting in the world. The Musée de Luxembourg and Paris did not have a collection that could equal that of the Metropolitan Museum in 1929. 35 Courbets, 30 works by Manet, 30 works by Monet, 200 works by Degas. It was an extraordinary collection. In addition to Rembrandt's and a few old master paintings, her collection began with Delacroix, the Barbizon School, all the landscapists, Daumier, Millet, Diaz de la Peña, through Courbet, Manet, Degas, Cézanne, Renoir, Monet. It was an extraordinary collection. It was exhibited in those same old galleries that I've been talking about until after the Second World War. Our collection, like so many national collections, was hidden during the war for safekeeping. When it returned after the Second World War, it was put in what were called new galleries, modern galleries, which were designed by a New York architect named Amar Embury, who wanted to make modern spaces. And in those days, in the 1940s, modern meant low ceilings, small galleries, very domestic in feel, with hanging, as you see, Fortuny fabric to give a feeling of richness. But it was a very different aesthetic, as you see, from the previous one. That was the aesthetic until 1970. Then, as in now, there was strong pressure from the community, from the trustees, from art dealers, and from collectors of modern art to make a demonstration of the museum's interest in and commitment to contemporary art. And so the Met did, Thomas Hoving, the director, a dramatic thing, which was to take all the galleries for old master painting and 19th century painting and empty them and hand it to the curator, the young curator named Henry Geltzaler, who was a good friend of Andy Warhol and David Hockney, was portrayed by these artists, and very close to all the painters then of the New York School, Frank Stella, Roy Lichtenstein, Ellsworth Kelly, Jasper Johns, etc. And he made a display of contemporary art, New York painting from 1946 to 1970. And so they had to do something with the 19th century collection during this year-long exhibition. And they made a set of very modern-feeling galleries for the 19th century. And here you see the display in 1970 of the 19th century paintings with their elaborate frames, works by Degas here, Manet, Monet, etc., in a space that was as modern and up-to-date as an airport lounge. And you see the terrazzo floor, you see the modern banquette, the pedestals, and this could have been the Museum of Modern Art, but it wasn't. It was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was a big change for that museum. Well, when that exhibition of contemporary art was closed, the 19th century pictures returned to the old master galleries, the old galleries, wings A, B, C, that had always been there. And Everett Fay, then the curator, installed the paintings on richly colored painted walls. These were blue galleries, for example, for the Impressionist paintings. His successor reinstalled the paintings on velvet-colored walls, Sir John Popinesi, who came to the Metropolitan Museum in the mid-1970s, hired by Thomas Hoving, our previous director, before Philippe de Montebello. And he installed paintings much as they had been installed at the National Gallery in London. He had for many years been director of the Victoria and Albert Museum and then worked at the British Museum. And he installed the paintings by National School, and within National School by artists. It was a very conventional display, but very handsome. And he was at the original, he was behind the original concept for these galleries called the André Meyer Galleries, which opened under his direction in 1981 with are masterpieces of 19th century Impressionism and Post-Impressionism on display in this very light-filled space, open and airy. And these galleries were said to be flexible. You could take these partitions and move them anywhere you want. But in fact, they were not flexible at all. These partitions were too heavy, they could never be moved. And as you see, there were arrangements always of 3 or 5. You always had to have 3 paintings or 5 paintings to make a decorative ensemble. And if one painting was lent to an exhibition somewhere, you're left with an ugly hole. You couldn't simply move the painting a little bit to the right for the next year while the painting is away, because you would have a space that was quite ugly. So we recognized that, in fact, this was not very flexible. And as these galleries began to be tired and shabby after 11 years of very strong visitation, we have 4 to 5 million visitors every year. The question came up, do we simply renew the galleries as they are with new fabric on the walls and repair the floors, or do we change the way we install them? And so my director allowed me to change the way we install them. I came forward with a plan. I just want to show you the location of our 19th century galleries are here. Those of you who know the Metropolitan Museum know this is Fifth Avenue. Here is the Richard Morris Hunt Great Hall. This is McKibben White Fifth Avenue facade. But for all the different master plans and architects we've had over the years, here was Wing A, Calvert Vaux. Here's Wing B, Theodore Weston. Wing C, an architect named Tuckerman. This was John Russell Pope in the middle here. He died before his plan could be built. Then Amar Embury II made a plan for this amount. Each succeeding generation of architects had a plan for the entire building. Not one of them ever saw his plan realized until Roche and Dinkeloo were able finally, under the direction of Philippe de Montebello, to complete the facade on three sides, to create a unified face to the park. And the idea, of course, was based on the notion of a crystal palace, with a reference back to the famous Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851. You have a crystal palace here in your park of Buen Retiro. And it was to create a reflective glass facade that would mirror the park, to create something that was sympathetic to the park and not so intrusive as a big marble building might be. So the space was on a balcony here on the left, called the Rockefeller Wing, inside this space here. And so we were able to destroy the so-called temporary and flexible partitions in 1991 and recreate instead some classical Beaux-Arts galleries. In order to do so, we made this architectural model, which was quite elaborate, and with small reproductions of the paintings to make sure that, in fact, we would have space for all of our works. We were going to have an elliptical gallery in the center, which was a reference to, if I have it here, do I have? Yes, the Frick collection by John Russell Pope. In my estimation, John Russell Pope was the most successful museum designer of the 20th century. He designed the classical galleries at the National Gallery of Art in the 1940s in Washington, and he changed the Frick Mansion into a museum in the 1930s and early 1940s. And I feel that he was the most sensitive to the display requirements for paintings made before the modern era. And so we were going to have, as a reference to that in his architecture, an elliptical gallery for our great figure paintings by Manet. But just as this gallery was laid up and the columns were being installed, we realized, my director and I, it's too small and the space is too claustrophobic. John Russell Pope would not have liked these galleries, and so we turned it immediately, it was not too late, from an ellipse into a rectangle, which is a double cube, in fact, and it's a much happier proportion. We wanted to have a long gallery for sculpture, a kind of Grande Galerie, a nod to the Louvre. This, by the way, is not a photograph of the gallery, but in fact of the model. You can see how precise the model was. And here's the actual gallery as it was first installed in 1992. With this famous painting by Rosa Bonheur that came from Cornelius Vanderbilt. In order to make our galleries, we had to study the lighting conditions, and we made a test gallery so we could study the proportions and a lighting system as well. And then when we installed the galleries, we made a kind of history of art for the 19th century, and I can walk you through the galleries as they were then installed. Sometimes we would try to make fortuitous analogies between a sculpture by Prado with a Sphinx and Gustave Moreau's famous Oedipus and the Sphinx from the Salon of 1866, which is the invitation to begin your cycle in the 19th century. At the very beginning, our earliest painting from 1801, an enigmatic painting of a woman drawing in a studio with a broken window, paintings by David and by Ingres, and Prudhon. So these are the first decades of the 19th century, the neoclassical students of Jacques-Louis David. Two handsome portraits at the Metropolitan bought in 1917 by Ingres from Edgar Degas' private collection when it was sold at public auction in Paris. Three handsome Turners showing his topographical views, his exploration of Venetian light, and then a late painting where light is dissolving form. This is a whale hunt painting. Opposite paintings by Delacroix, who, among the French Romantics, was interested in British painting. The history of French Romanticism is really the story of an interest in British painting and an accommodation of British painting into French style, leading to a gallery of Corot, starting with oil sketches done outdoors and leading to these to a big salon painting, Hagar and Ishmael, and finally his late landscapes that always have a very pearly light and palette. We have an extraordinary collection of his figure paintings, coming all from the Havemeyer collection, because Mrs. Havemeyer was a good friend of Mary Cassatt, the American artist. Mary Cassatt was a good friend of Edgar Degas. And Edgar Degas said to Mary Cassatt, "I think that Corot's figure paintings are better than his landscapes." Mary Cassatt repeated this to Mrs. Havemeyer, and Mrs. Havemeyer went out and made a collection of his figure paintings, and they came to the Metropolitan Museum. Fine paintings of the Barbizon school, romantic landscape, either by Théodore Rousseau or Honoré Daumier, or Millet. But the glory of our collection, of course, is really these mid-19th century figure paintings by Manet and Courbet. And so this was the gallery that was going to be an ellipse, which became, in fact, a double rectangle, a double cube. And we have an unparalleled collection of these works, many recently on loan to the Prado, just 3 or 4 years ago, for your exhibition of Manet, including the bullfighter that I think Manuela Mena has identified for us. Yes, remember, for in your catalog entry. So this was I think his name was Caetano, who was one of the famous matadors of the corrida right here in Madrid. When Manet came to Spain in 1865, he attended a corrida and took home a little carte de visite, a postcard of this famous bullfighter. Extraordinary paintings by Courbet. Many of these are now in a Courbet exhibition that we've jointly organized with the Musée d'Orsay at the Grand Palais in Paris, if you go to Paris before New Year's. And unparalleled collections of the work of Edgar Degas, including the first set of sculptures by Degas, which were cast after Degas' death, thanks to the intervention of Mrs. Havemeyer, who gave the money for these works to be cast into bronze. So we have a full set of these, I think about 90 examples of bronze. Extraordinary pastels, mainly from the 1870s and 80s. 80s and 90s, I should say. Ballet scenes. And then from the Manet Gallery, we had the extraordinary opportunity to incorporate a private collection, the collection of Ambassador Annenberg and his wife, a collection put together in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. They wanted their collection to remain intact, but to be seen in the context of the other paintings by 19th century artists at the Met. So we devised a system where we could have 3 galleries of the Annenberg collection, and on either side, galleries of non-Annenberg paintings, Havemeyer and other paintings. And this way, you could walk from one to the next, and of course the visitor doesn't care who gave the painting to the Metropolitan Museum. The visitor only wants to see fine works of art. But we were able, in this way, to have, say, an Annenberg Renoir, an Annenberg Renoir, adjacent to the gallery with other Renoir. And so the visitor doesn't really think very much. They walk from Renoir to Renoir and enjoy the display. So here's the gallery of Renoir, and on the left, Sisley. Manet, his boating scene from 1874 when he's working closely under the influence of Claude Monet, and here's Claude Monet and Madame Monet and their son, Jean, painted by Manet. Madame Monet here on the right. Here are paintings from the Annenberg collection, Monet, Manet, looking through to the gallery of Monet paintings at the Met, with the terrace at Saint-Adresse from 1866, La Grenouillère of 1869, and then a splendid wall of landscapes from the 1870s and 1880s. Large still lifes, looking into a room of later Monets of the 1890s, these beautiful pearly incandescent paintings, each one of these representing a series by Monet, the poplars, the Îles aux Orties, the Morning on the Seine, and the haystacks, or grain stacks. Large water lily paintings and the path of irises from the garden at Giverny. The Annenberg collection was very important for the Met because even though we had large holdings in all of these artists, for strange reasons, often we had large gaps where we had no late paintings by Monet. The latest painting was 1900, this water lily that came from the Havemeyer collection. And so thanks to the Annenberg collection, we now have 2 large-scale murals by Monet. And then another collector, Mrs. Bertram Smith, gave us this unfinished late painting from perhaps the year before Monet died in 1926. Cézanne's coming from the Annenberg collection on the right, but referring to Cézanne's already in the Havemeyer collection on the left. Annenberg Van Goghs, looking onto other Van Goghs from the Metropolitan Museum collection. We're not very rich in the work of pointillism, but we have several masterpieces by Seurat, his final large study for the painting now in Chicago, the Sunday afternoon at the island of the Grand Jatte, this beautiful nighttime scene called La Parade de Cirque. And when you stand in this room and look at these paintings, you see an Annenberg Seurat here through the wall, and then you see in the final gallery a Pissarro that's also in the pointillist style. When Pissarro was working very closely with Georges Seurat and trying to accommodate his pointillist or divisionist method into his own art. Here's this painting. One of the big discoveries in 1993 was the creation of a Pissarro room, because it turns out that we have a very fine and complete collection of works by Pissarro that came to us in very many ways from different collectors, but when you put it all together, you have his work displayed from the beginning of his career until the end. And this was the display as it opened in 1993 with an important early cast by Rodin of the Age of Bronze, looking through to Courbet, Manet, Courbet's Woman with a Parrot. You notice these columns here and the kind of rich decor in the corridor. Well, now, 14 years later, we've destroyed it yet again. And these new galleries are going to open in just 1 week in New York. Here were the galleries that we created in 1993. And here are our new galleries, 10,000 square feet or 1,000 square meters that are opening up in 1 week, with new galleries for more 19th century and early modern paintings. What we were able to do is, in the Rockefeller wing, this is the old wall of the 19th century galleries here, and we made a balcony that comes out almost to the window. And in this balcony, we were able to capture 1,000 square meters of new space. And one thing we did was to simplify the corridor, because we found that the columns were too elaborate, that the architecture seemed inauthentic, perhaps too much of pastiche. And so we made a simpler neoclassical aesthetic that seemed to us closer in keeping with Richard Morris Hunt and McKim Meaden White. And so we were able to destroy about 8 of those columns that you saw from my earlier gallery. So if you look at these doors here, you see no columns anymore, whereas before there were these columns. So we have a simpler aesthetic, but again, a giant step backwards. It enables us to display more of our paintings from the 19th century. And in fact, more of the paintings from our very first bequest of modern European art from this woman, Katherine Lorillard Wolfe, in 1887. So here you see a work by Bonnat, by Hans Makart, by Regnault, Salome. And of course, some of our old favorites, Meissonier, Bastien Lepage, Co. And these pictures were just taken Tuesday morning, so they're fresh. You see, we're still getting ready for the opening. Rodin is going back with Puvis de Chavannes, his close friend. Here's a fine work by Bonnat, which has not been on view for more than 50 years. We'll have an entire gallery devoted to the Orientalist painters, the European painters of North Africa. Some of them we've been recently buying, like this small work by Girodet. a new promised gift of Horace Vernet, a Chasserio that we recently bought, a painting by Gérôme that came to us already in the 19th century. Looks like the Mosque at Cordoba, of course. We'll have a display, of course, again of Barbizon, but we're using richer colors in the new galleries. And finally, and I'm so glad to have achieved this, we're able to hang Manet on a blood red wall because his paintings were designed in the 1860s specifically to hang on this color, the color, say, of dried blood, and to jump off of the walls and to provide a strong contrast to the wall, which when you have a light-colored wall, light gray or light blue, you don't get the same effect as when these paintings are hung on red. And we're able to hang paintings which in some instances haven't been shown even for 100 years, like the Boldini portrait of the Duchess of Marlborough and her son, the future William Randolph Churchill, right there. And we're able to make the same kind of juxtapositions from gallery to gallery. So you see a beautiful salon portrait by Renoir, 1879, a woman in a black dress with her children. Here's a Boldini done 20 years later, a beautiful woman in a black dress with her child. And I was just saying to Gabriela Finalde, when I was looking at your handsome display of 19th century Spanish painting, I was hanging a wall only this week with Boldini, Sargent, Zorn, and you don't see right here is a Sorolla. And these, of course, were the great competitors right around 1900, going to, and Madrazo and Fortuny was the last in this quintet of artists who each were trying to paint the rich Americans and the rich Russians who were coming to Venice for the season and to have their portraits painted. We're also hanging, much to the surprise and dismay of my French-born director, Philippe de Montebello, a few Americans in with the 19th century Europeans, which is, as these paintings were hung already 100 years ago at the Metropolitan Museum. So here you have some of the famous paintings by John Singer Sargent. And I told my director, who was rather unhappy earlier this week, not to worry, that John Singer Sargent was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. He attended art school in London and Paris and only spent a few years in America. So we can consider him more of a European painter than an American. And he thought, okay, it's not so bad. And we're also bringing into the galleries works made up until the First World War, works by Picasso especially that have strong links to the 19th century, to Cézanne, to Gauguin, and to the history of painting, and have not yet dramatically cut with tradition as Cubism would. And the funny thing about this installation is the more we go forward in time, the more we go backward. Because when Gertrude Stein left us her portrait in 1946, or when the actor came in the 1940s, of course these paintings were hung in the context of our modern European paintings, Sargent and Renoir. But as the century progressed and we were redefining what was contemporary and modern art, the historical paintings were brought forward into a new idea about modernism. But now, in our day and age, I think we can have a more flexible idea about the history of art. And it's not so shocking to see early Picasso in the context of Sargent or Sorolla. And as I say, the more we progress in time, the more we step backward at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, trying to have an integrated display from the very first founding of the museum in 1866, founded by philanthropists and artists, to the very first display at the museum, opening in 1879. We were showing works by living artists, European and American, in the context of 5,000 years of art history. And that's exactly what we're doing today when we opened a display a few months ago of Damien Hirst's Shark, the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. We're bringing contemporary art, a work by living artists, into the context of the history of art in Europe and America, and to some extent, to the extent that we can, world art for 5,000 years. That was our mission when we were founded in 1866, and that continues to be our mission today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer your questions.